have also noticed that, I thought, oh, well, you're going to want to do every school project about mythology now because you love it so much. And that is not the case.
Why did it happen?
Because nothing kills that intrinsic motivation, like assigning grades to it, right? It's like everybody who is really good at a craft, and then they open an Etsy store and then they hate that craft, right?
That's very interesting.
As soon as you impose external standards and expectations on that thing that you just loved for the love of it, do a project on this thing you love. Oh, now you hate it and I killed it. I'm sorry.
Welcome back to the OpenEd podcast. I'm your sometimes host, Ella, and today I am joined by Brenna Clarke Gray. I'm super excited to have this conversation. She is an educator, a researcher, a podcast host, and I think she will have a lot of insights in different directions that we might not normally step into. So welcome to the podcast. And can you please, just as an introduction, tell me how you got fascinated by education? I feel like that is always such an interesting place to start, is what is everybody's personal story? Why do they care so much?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, because everybody does come into education from a unique path. So I started really being interested in becoming a teacher when I was a student myself as an undergraduate, and I was really blessed to go to Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario. Carleton is a real leader in supplemental education, and so by the time I was in second year, I was leading supplemental learning workshops. So these are like little workshops that go alongside. So you've got a class where there's a high percentage of students who we call it a DFW rate in post-secondary. It's a high rate of students who would get a D and F or withdraw from the course entirely. And you create these little workshops that go alongside the course to help students master the study skills that they need to succeed in the course. And the neat thing about that model is that it was entirely peer-led. So it was just a student who had done well in the course before running these workshops to hopefully show students how they could modeling the skills to succeed in the course, really. And I loved it. I just really loved it. It clicked with me immediately, and I loved the environment. And the Center for Initiatives in Education at Carleton ran that program. I think it's probably it's ancient history now, but at the time it ran that program, and they did a lot of sort of in-service training for students who were facilitators in the program, to really learn about learning and active learning in particular, and how so much of what we do at the post-secondary level is great for information transfer, but isn't really about learning. And so from there, I decided I was going to be a professor, and I did a PhD in English and became a college instructor in just outside of Vancouver, British Columbia. I did that for 9 years. And I always found that I was more interested in the hows and whys of what was happening in the classroom than I was just in my subject material. I was doing the stuff you're supposed to do, publishing articles in English literature. Canadian literature is my specialty, comic books specifically. So it's not like it wasn't fun. It was very fun. But I became interested in faculty support. Like, how could I help my colleagues teach better? So many of us in post-secondary teaching, which may be something that we share with the homeschool community, we come to teaching with no teaching experience whatsoever. We're subject matter experts, but we're lucky if we've had a few semesters of teaching assistantship or research assistantship, or like really any conversation about teaching and learning, and that's getting better. Sector-wide, that's getting better, but it's still, most of us come with no training, and then we run into problems in the classroom and we don't really have a set of strategies to deal with it. And that was the kind of stuff, like talking through those kind of like rich problems with my colleagues was always the stuff that I enjoyed the most. And so, and I was always particularly interested in technology and how technology mediates education. And a job became available at Thompson Rivers University. It was a tenure track job in faculty support. And I jumped at it and I got it. And then, since then I've moved into the research stream here. So I'm doing faculty support, but also researching right now really stuff that sounds really boring, but isn't, like how we procure technology in the university and why that matters, but probably not super relevant to a homeschooling audience. But yeah, that's sort of my journey. Is I was a classroom teacher first and a subject matter expert second, and then I found out how weird that is to be, and I wanted to help my colleagues feel more comfortable in difficult situations in the classroom.
That's very interesting. I actually, whenever you said the how to procure technology, brought down to a very basic level, it is the same question that parents ask all the time,
That's
which
true,
is,
yeah.
What tech do I actually need? What tech is actually going to be useful? And everything, sells itself as the one solution that you need, right?
Yeah.
But trying to figure out what are the things that are actually going to help our journey. Before we
Yeah.
get into that, I would love to take a step back, all the way back to when you were teaching these students, right? They were struggling in a classroom. Some sort of subject wasn't clicking with them. So what are the basics of teaching, and what makes good teaching? Because, right, you said that there's a difference between information transfer and learning. And I think
Yeah.
that is so accurate. It's well, I could be the smartest person in the world, but if I can't explain it in a way that's useful for you, right, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I believe that at its core, learning, teaching, and learning is relational work. If you don't have a relationship with the person who is trying to teach you, and that doesn't have to mean anything more than a sense that they care about your progress through the discipline, your understanding of the material. I think that's when it's knowledge transfer, right? And you might as well watch a video lecture at that point, because there's no relationality, there's no connection there. I've always been really interested in how difficult it is to convince people that any kind of active learning strategy, whether it is project-based learning or using gamification or any kind of method where students aren't just doing the rote work of learning, but they're having opportunities to make new connections in their brain with the material. There's a surprising amount of resistance to the idea that we learn better when we're actively engaging with the material. And part of that is because the education systems that many of us work within are not really very conducive, right? If you are lecturing to a 400 student auditorium, it's pretty hard to get everybody up and around and doing a group project in the middle of class, right? We haven't typically thought of, especially post-secondary education, as something that needs to be relational or active. Even traditional methods in schools are often based on compliance, right? It's based on what can I measure and how well can you achieve this thing that demonstrates the measure, none of which is really learning, right? Measuring learning is so hard to do. It's really hard to measure whether somebody's learned something or not. It's really easy to measure compliance, like how many times did you come to class? How many times did you raise your hand to ask a question? How many of these in-class exercises did you hand in, right? That's easy to measure. And so I think we often end up in a system, because of the constraints of austerity and funding and precarity and staffing, we often end up in these situations, and even just time, even, in a homeschooling context, it's just time disappears, right? So we often end up in a situation where we find ourselves looking for what we can measure rather than looking for where the learning is taking place. And I think that it's really hard to do that second thing. And we would all be better off if we acknowledged how hard it is to measure whether somebody's learning something or not.
Yeah, as a fundamental, before you get into teaching, that is something that is so important to accept. Okay, well, learning is going to matter much, much more than these, what you were calling compliance things. And it's going to be hard to measure it, right, over time. But something that stuck out to me, so in my own experience, right, science class was always very hands-on. It was always group projects. But I always had a hard time inside of it, right? So when do you, as a teacher, right, there's no one size fits all, there's no one perfect solution, but as you were going through this process, I imagine that it was very much an experimental process. It's okay, there's something that the student's not understanding, let me try and figure it out. So as you were going through this process of trying to figure them out and their gaps maybe, what was your approach to doing that? Because if I had to guess, looking back now and knowing more about education, some of my gaps had to do with fundamental memorization things. I did enough to complete the assignment, and I studied
you learned
enough
to the test, right? You learned to the test, not for the discipline itself.
Exactly. And so then I'd get into these in-person group projects and things that were hands-on, and while they were great and they were fun, because I didn't have these fundamental things memorized, I didn't have anything to build on anyways. So it was nice that we were doing things that were hands-on, but it wasn't helpful, right?
Yeah. Part of this is because of how we signal value and importance to learners, right? Like oftentimes that content test is worth the most. So you
Yep.
study to the content test. And then those active activities are often like kind of the nice to haves. They're often weighted a lot more lightly, or they're weighted against maybe different learning objectives in fairness to the assessment, right? Like maybe what they actually are assessing is your ability to work in a group and they don't care so much about the material outcomes. I mean, that's possible too, right? That's an issue because learners are smart. I mean, we need to start always our educational journey from a fundamental acceptance that learners are smart and they will prioritize their time as they see fit. And I always used to tell my students, like, my class has to be a priority, but I understand it's not the only priority. In fact, like, I kind of hope my second year Canadian literature class is not your major priority in life. Like that, it would be a sad story, right? So we need to recognize that learners are always balancing priorities and they're making decisions based on like, you told me this test was worth 40% of my grade, so this is the thing I studied for. And that cool project that was worth 10, I cared about a lot less. And so I didn't worry about whether I had the fundamentals in place before I tackled it. So, that's a component as well. I love universal design for learning as a way of thinking about approaching a classroom where I have a group of students with varied skill sets, interests, and priorities. Universal design for learning is thought of often as an accessibility strategy, like a way to ensure that learners of all capabilities can succeed in a classroom. But universal design for learning is a great philosophy that benefits everybody because at its core, it's about multiple ways of sharing information and then multiple ways of demonstrating your knowledge. So I'm not just going to stand up here and talk at you. I'm also going to, send you on a research exercise where you come up with some of the information yourself and bring it back to class and we discuss it. Or I'm also going to show you this great video, or maybe we have some sort of VR walkthrough situation. I'm going to give lots of different modalities to the way I share the information. And then similarly, I'm going to offer you lots of different opportunities to show me what you've learned. So, some learners, I was definitely the learner who did best with like an essay. I love an essay. I'm verbose. I love to share all my knowledge on the page. I love a footnote where I can put extra stuff I read about. Like for me, that's a perfect way to demonstrate my learning. But it's not for everybody. And especially, in so many classes where the essay is the learning object in the class, but this class doesn't have time to actually address like how to write an essay. We often assume learners are coming to our class with that understanding, which is, even if it's true in the abstract sense, it's probably not true within the specifics of that discipline, right? Like we all have different ways we write and express ourselves in our disciplines. So maybe I also do need a group project for those students who learn best in dialogue and relationship with others. Maybe I could let them make a video that makes the same argument that they would have made in a paper, but articulates it in a way that they find more accessible. And then maybe I've got a kid who hates tech and is like, I would rather die than make a video, or I'd rather die than film myself and put it on screen. So maybe I need to be creative about the kind of project that I allow them to do. Maybe I even need to let them propose it to me, right? And testing works for some students, so maybe testing needs to be part of my constellation of assessment. But the more different ways I can invite learners to share their learning with me, the less likely I am evaluating for the things I don't really want to be evaluating for, like their capacity for essay writing, unless it's an essay writing class, or their facility with video editing technology, right? Unless it's that kind of class. Offering lots of different opportunities for students to show their learning also means that they're less likely to be able to succeed in a course by simply learning to an individual test, right? It's less about, okay, I need to have these facts, and more about, I need to show how I actually implement these facts, right? How I work with them, how I show my understanding of them. And that's hard to do, right? Because it's putting a huge amount of demand on the instructor, not only to find multiple ways of sharing that information, but offering multiple opportunities to demonstrate that knowledge. And again, we come back to the idea that like oftentimes our classrooms and our learning environments aren't actually structured in the best possible way for learning, unfortunately. And so a lot of time we have to kind of recognize that there's tensions there. But even in small ways, if we can resist having courses where we only test through multiple choice, or we only assess through the essay, where we at least offer different units, different modalities, so students can shine in different kinds of ways that actually, connects to their capacities and their interests. I think that is the best way to tackle a situation where you have multiple kinds of learners in the room.
Out of curiosity, how much time would you recommend people spend on a lesson? Because that's the other constraint, right? Like a teacher has 20 to many more kids in her class, right? And she needs to get through a certain amount of lessons for her to be comfortable with what she has done. And so it is nice to talk about all these different methods. And I know that most teachers that especially love what they do are like, I would love to do all these different types of things. But then there's a constraint of, okay, but there's only so much time in a day. How do you decide what to do?
Well, and very few of us as teachers get to decide that, right?
Yeah.
We're almost all working within systems. Even when we're homeschooling or unschooling, we're still working in like a 24-hour day, which, I didn't choose. I would have given us more. I think that it's a great question, and constraints are always a part of how we can conceive of our teaching and learning. An answer that I come back to a lot is that I often think we are trying to do too much information transfer to be useful in most courses, right? And, this is, again, like now I'm taking on curriculum standards, so often state or province created, right? Difficult things to challenge. But, we have a tendency, many of us as teachers, especially when we're passionate about our subject, to kind of just one thing our students to death. Like, here's the stuff you absolutely have to know, content-wise, to move from chemistry 1 to chemistry 2. You have to know this stuff. But here's some amazing, cool, interesting things that I love about chemistry that I'm just going to stack on top. And sometimes we don't do a great job of articulating to our learners what's core information and what's added information, right? So on the one hand, I think most of us should probably try to scale back the amount of content that we transfer so that we have that classroom time to let students actually work with the material, right?
Interesting.
It's great to say, like, I have all this information that I need to share with my students, but if they're not actually retaining anything because we're just sort of droning at them, or we're just overloading them and not giving them the chance to actually put their hands on the material and work with it, then did we gain anything by attempting to share all that information? So I think that's a huge piece, and that's a difficult piece, as I say, because we come up against standards and expectations and all kinds of externally mandated facts. One of the opportunities of the pandemic in post-secondary education was that we had the opportunity to actually scale back a lot of classes. We spent a lot of time saying, okay, students aren't going to be able to get through all this at home on their own, or students aren't going to be able to get through all this if they have to miss 2 weeks of classes for illness. So how do we rethink our course material to scale back, to offer less, to let them do more with the content? I was sort of hopeful that that would be like, we would recognize that our students were learning more when they were offered less information. But we, like many things with the pandemic, we just went right back to the way we were doing it before.
No, that's actually so fascinating. And I actually think that that'd be a great exercise for people to implement is, okay, if they walk away with one piece of information, or if they walk away with a couple pieces of information, like that is good enough as a foundation for them. What would you rather them do? Like walk away knowing these things, or like grasping at straws with these 10 extra things, right? I had an experience like this. It was kind of recently, but basically it was a philosophy class, and there was a lot that this professor was trying to get through. And I looked to one of the other students afterwards, and I was just like, I was like, if you would have focused on the top 3 things, like I've studied philosophy before, I enjoy it. So like, it wasn't that hard for me, but it was really quick. It was a lot of information. And the only reason that I could keep up at all was because I've already heard it all before. But like, if this was new to somebody, they would walk away with nothing. It's like so much that it's like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I just like, you don't even have time to process it. So like, if instead you just say, okay, what are the most important things that they walk away with this class understanding? You strip it to its bare fundamentals. Like the people that are very interested will come back to this, but now they will really know these things that really matter and then be able to accept the other information. But as you were talking, it was like, oh yeah, like that would have made so much sense. Like in some of my classes growing up, like there were a lot of concepts, a lot of facts, a lot of things thrown at me. And as a student, especially as a student that was trained to care so much about tests, right? Like you're grasping onto every single number, every single piece of data, because it's like, what is going to be on the test? Whereas like the really important thing is, okay, what happened? Why did it happen? Like, let's reason through it, not necessarily like all of the specific dates and all the specific times and all the specific members. It's like once you understand the story, putting in the specifics is a lot easier.
Yeah, and as teachers, we joke about the student saying like, well, is this going to be on the test? Like, is this going to be on the test? I talked for 3 hours and then the student raised their hand and said, is this going to be on the test? And it's like a funny joke that we talk about as teachers, but also it probably belies like some pretty bad signposting when students are asking that at the end of the class, right? And a student who is feeling really lost and really overwhelmed asks that question, not a student who has kept up and managed the material. And so how we better manage our learners' overwhelm, I think, is a huge piece of allowing them to learn successfully. And I'm not saying this as someone who's not guilty of it. When I used to teach the British survey literature course, I was like, you need all of the historical context. Like, before we read Wordsworth, let's really get into the heads of the Romantics and let's make sure we understand every significant historical event that happened that shaped who they were. And that was too much, right? It was way too much. It's important to say, like, okay, the Romantics were really stressed out about the Industrial Revolution and they really felt like something was being lost in the way the English countryside was being reinvented, and so they wrote this nostalgic poetry. But you actually don't need me to explain all of the background of that for 2 hours to then sit and read Tintern Abbey and find it meaningful, because actually we all have experiences of going back to some place from our childhood and now it's a Costco and it's like, that's kind of sad and I feel a little bit nostalgic for that park I used to play in. That's Tintern Abbey's vibe, right? Once you have that, then when you decide that actually British history is my thing and I want to learn more about the Romantics, you have a whole world that opens up to you, and you didn't need it in the British survey course that drowned you, right? And I'm sure the first few times I taught that course, I just drowned learners in information.
Yeah. No, I mean, like, and especially whenever you have a teacher that's passionate, it's like, let me share every single thing that I love about this.
Exactly. One more thing.
Exactly. But I think it is definitely back to kind of what you talk about. It's all about the relationship. It's all about the humanity. It's all about the relatable aspect of it, right? Like, why is history so important for most people to just like know the basics and like know the stories? It's because history repeats itself, It's because it's important. But like in the moment, did all these people know all the facts? No, they knew the story. They knew like, they knew, this was happening and then I was frustrated and then this and then, like they knew the story more than they knew all the facts, and facts unfold over time a lot of the times.
And so
like
the problem with like multiple choice testing as like the main methodology that we use for assessing learning is that it's very hard to get exactly what you're talking about there. That narrative arc it gets lost in all disciplines when you create a multiple choice exam, because you have to focus on like high detail facts. It's really hard to assess an understanding of the arc of whatever the discipline is, whatever the semester has been, when you're drilling down to those kind of facts.
Yeah, exactly. That's very fascinating. Something I was curious about, have you studied motivation much? Because I think something that most teachers get frustrated with is like they could mess with their teaching style, they could try different lessons, but like really it's up to the child and the student and the learner to decide that they're willing and ready to learn. Because if they're not, like no matter what kind of teacher you have, no matter what kind of lesson you're creating, like if they've decided they're not learning, they're not going to learn.
Well, yeah, and motivation is one of those huge frustrations because the ways in which we try to influence it in the classroom are often extrinsic motivations, whether that's grades or, candy, like whatever it is you're using to motivate your learners. If it's coming from you, then it's an extrinsic motivator. It's coming from the outside. And we have known for generations that extrinsic motivation is less valuable than intrinsic motivation. That when you want to learn something for yourself, you are more motivated to do it. And we see that with everything we do in our daily lives, right? Like, I am an obsessive Formula One fan, and nobody is testing me on that information, but I have a vast back catalog of details because it helps me to understand the races better. And so then when I watch a race, it's more fun for me, right? That's intrinsic motivation for learning. You cannot achieve that in every course you teach every student, because there has to be some baseline level of interest and connection to the material to get that intrinsic motivation. And so we are always in this tension between like, how much do we rely on extrinsic motivation versus how much is that extrinsic motivation actually killing any desire to develop intrinsic motivation in learning about that discipline, right? Because if I'm only learning a subject for the marks, and that's a great example of what we were just talking about, where we lose the arc because we're focused on the details, I may be actually destroying my own intrinsic motivation for learning that subject, right? Like, lots and lots of students think they dislike subject A, B, or C in high school, and then they find it again in university, or they find it again in their own life later, and they love it, right? Mm-hmm. And that's that example of like, well, like testing school thinking, as one of my guests on the podcast says, really can crush our intrinsic motivation. And I don't have an answer to that question because it's so difficult. It's so difficult to try to figure out what will help any individual learner, especially early in their learning journey before they know it for themselves, what will help them foster that internal motivation, or intrinsic motivation, sorry. But what I know is that learning to tests and learning turned into kind of like a rote exercise and overwhelming our students with too much content, too much information, making it difficult to see those larger arcs and how those things connect to our lives. I know that all of that kills intrinsic motivation. But again, and I say this a lot on my podcast, we are trapped in this system that makes it really, really hard to resist those things. Oftentimes because we simply can't, right? I have a state mandated test. My learners have to take it at the end of the semester. I don't have a choice in that matter. Or we're pressured, right, by other aspects within our system to approach learning in a particular way. I always tell the example of when I first started as a teacher and I took attendance in my classroom because I thought that I had to because everybody else did. And it wasn't until, I don't know, I think I've been teaching at that institution for like 5 years that I finally read the attendance policy and realized we had an attendance policy, but we had to choose to activate it in our classroom. We could just opt not to. And
that's funny.
I had no idea. And I hated taking attendance because I was bad at it. I would forget to do it because I'd be excited about something. I'd forget to do it at the beginning of class, and then I'd try to catch up and I would fail. Or, I would get the attendance marked and then I'd lose the sheet. Or I was just hopeless at it. And because it didn't matter to me, right? Ultimately, what mattered to me was the engagement of the participants in the classroom, not whether their butt was in the seat or not. So, for 5 years, I struggled to care about it and never managed to. And so, we are trapped within systems sometimes, and sometimes we just think we are, but these structures are not designed to instill intrinsic motivation, and that makes it really, really hard. And again, I don't have an answer to it. I would like to. I think knowing the issue and really trying to help students see the bigger picture of the discipline that we're teaching in, I think that's a big piece of it. When students can make personal connections to the discipline, that helps. And it's one of those things that may not come now, right? Something like every person who teaches writing knows that students hate the essay writing class when they're in it. And then, 5 years later, you get a letter from a student saying I really didn't understand what you were talking about then, but I just got into grad school and I actually use everything you taught me all the time. And I'm so grateful. And it's oh, that's cool. I'm sorry that you hated it at the time, but here we are, right? But that is a big piece of it. Also, motivation and learning don't necessarily follow a school year rhythm. It may be years before a student realizes that a connection that they made in a class when they were 14 is actually something that they love and want to pursue for the rest of their life. We just don't know. And so all we can do is kind of plant the seeds and hope that we're not crushing them with the other structures of education as we move along, which is not a very satisfying answer, I recognize, but I think it is actually the true answer.
Yeah, if we had a single answer for that question, right? If only. But we don't.
Very wealthy. I would not be teaching at a state school.
Exactly. I'm curious your take too on so many of our listeners are homeschool families who really, really value their kids being lifelong learners. And since you have children of your own, I'm curious your take on how to help instill that, right, like almost internal drive for learning in a kid early on, and what that early education can do as a child grows.
Yeah, so I have an 8-year-old and a 1-year-old. So I'm at very different places in this journey with both of them. And the one thing that I have come to really believe is that boredom is incredibly important to learning. My 8-year-old loves mythology from anywhere in the world. Stacks and stacks of mythology books, listens to mythology podcasts all the time, will parrot a million facts about mythology. Often I'm like, is that true? Like, I don't know. We're so far beyond any understanding I have of, the basic Greek and Romans at this point that I just take it on faith. And that 100% came out of, I think, probably boredom, particularly during the pandemic closure period. Like, my kiddo was at the exact age. He had only been in daycare for a little bit before we transitioned to being at home full time. I was responsible for transitioning my university from fully in-person classes to fully online courses, and I'd only been at the institution for 7 months when the pandemic hit. So that kid had a lot of time, around 3, 4, just starting to read on their own to just figure stuff out. I mean, it wasn't free reign. They were like in the house. But so many new interests emerged in that period, like that have become lifelong interests. Like, my kiddo still loves anything to do with mythology, anything to do with sort of the ancient world. Will devour, was just reading to me last night a book about ancient Egypt.
That's awesome.
It is awesome, right? And that did not come from me because I have no personal inherent interest in that. The reality is that there were other interests that were born of that time that I'm much less jazzed about. Pokemon. Encyclopedic knowledge of Pokemon. Do I care at all about Pokemon? No, I do not. Is every fact I've ever learned about Pokemon been entirely against my will? Yes, it has. But, by letting a kid be bored and find interest, they're going to find some that are like, let me tell you about my kid and how much they love mythology. And then they're going to be like, Jesus Christ. Sorry. Then I'm going to be like, oh my God, if I have to hear one more fact about Pokemon, I'm going to lose it, right? So giving kids space for that, it's one of the strengths and opportunities of homeschooling. I mean, my kiddo is in public school, but I could see from that time that we were all home together that being able to kind of explore whatever interest emerged for them was really valuable. And I think that in general, we don't give kids a lot of time and space to be bored. This is the first year we've had a lot of high demand after school activities. We're doing martial arts and playing the flute now. And so there's suddenly much less time for boredom and much less time for just searching out random interesting facts. And I'm seeing how the benefit of committing to something and focusing on it definitely exists, right? Seeing strong discipline, a real willingness to commit to musical instrument, to physical activity, to improve. That's really cool. But you can also see the trade-off, right? Less time for random flipping through mythology books and coming up with some new fact and heading off to the library to find a new book about it, right? Like, it ebbs and flows throughout a child's life, obviously. I have also noticed that, I thought, oh, well, you're going to want to do every school project about mythology now because you love it so much. And that is not the case because nothing kills that intrinsic motivation like assigning grades to it, right? It's like, everybody who is really good at a craft and then they open an Etsy store and then they hate that craft, right? As soon as you impose external standards and expectations on that thing that you just loved for the love of it, not for everybody, but I think for a lot of us, that kind of kills what makes us want to keep learning about it.
Yeah,
which again,
that makes sense.
Hard for the education system though, right? To manage that, like, oh, do a project on this thing you love. Oh, now you hate it and I killed it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that difference between like doing something for yourself versus doing something for others. Like, I've chatted with quite a few people who write on Substack and like they love writing on Substack, but when there's this temptation over time to start writing for other people. It's like, what do other people want to hear rather than like, what do I just want to write about? And like, it changes the quality of your writing and the way that you care about it and the way that you publish it and, what you put into it. That's very interesting. I was curious about the culture of your home. So I've gotten very fascinated by like the subtle things that you can do as like a person that is building your home, right? One of my like side interests is interior design. I'm like learning about it, but something very fascinating about interior design is this idea that you should build a space that serves your own purposes. So, like, what do you care about? And a space that makes it subconsciously easier for you to do the things that you want to do, right? So, like, I want to read. So, I have a lot of spaces throughout my home that make it very easy for me to say, okay, I'm just going to pick up a book, right? Or, like, I'm just going to, like, sit down and, like, it is so easy for me to do that. And I would assume, because just reflecting on my life, like, I read a lot growing up, but it was because my parents had so many books around that when I got bored, back to boredom, I would go and pull a book. And so I'm curious about the culture of learning in your home, and then also what your family's relationship with technology is like. Because in the pandemic, right, a lot of families had children that were just glued to their iPads all day long. And it's very fascinating because I think your son's story about picking up something that is just like a side interest, he's very, very passionate about, like, that is more rare than not.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I definitely grew up similarly in a house where there were books around all the time. And we had TV. We certainly watched TV. I certainly had my fair share of sick days in front of the TV. But we never had the kind of living room, like wall-sized TV situation. We had like a small, like black and white TV in one room and like a little one with the like VCR built into it in another. So it was there and it was definitely a part of my life. I'm not going to pretend I didn't watch every episode of The Simpsons live to air. But it wasn't a centerpiece. Like, it wasn't the focal point of the family. And I have tried to do that in my home as well. My husband is a big TV guy, but our big TV is in the basement. That's our only TV in the house. And I really noticed when we moved from living in small apartments where the TV was like in the living room and just kind of on all the time, you know, especially when I was home raising my first baby, like it was just kind of company. To now that we're in a townhouse, we have our TV in the basement and I'm home again with my baby and my second baby, and the TV is never on because I never go down to the basement because my husband's office is down there, and the last thing I'm going to do is bring like a noisy 1-year-old and their TV programs to that space, right? And so I think that I get exactly what you're saying about the architecture of the home encouraging what we want to engage with. Now, we're a pretty techy home. I'm an educational technologist. I'm interested in these things. We all have gadgets and devices. But for my kids, my eldest has an iPad, and that was first and foremost a method to connect with family because my parents are in Ontario on the other side of the country, so are my in-laws, and so being able to, you know, face chat was a huge thing in the pandemic. We would just call up friends and they would chat. Very useful when I was in a meeting. I'd be like, call somebody at a different time zone and be like, hey, you want to hang out with my kid for a bit? That would be really useful. But the primary, you know, when you look around my house, you see books before you see tech. And I think that that's really valuable in general. I really want my kids to have a good understanding of the world around them. I don't want them to feel like they are out of step with the times. I think that can be really hard on kids. But at the same time, we all read every day, and reading is a big part of the family life. And podcasts, we listen to so many podcasts in this family. It's very funny. One of the first times my kiddo went anywhere to be babysat, he got to the person's house and they're like, oh, I have all these TV shows I have ready for you. Like, he was like, can I just listen to a new episode of my podcast? I'm just like, I don't know. I don't know how this happens, except that I grew up in, I don't know if you guys have many Canadian listeners, but I grew up in a CBC household. We listened to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation all the time. My brother used to joke that like there was a nail through the dial of the kitchen radio and you could not adjust it to anything else.
That is so funny.
It was always like news and information and talking. And I think for me, podcasts have kind of taken that place. I feel very comforted by human voices speaking. So yeah, I think that the culture of our home is primarily, it's a lot of talking. It's a lot of listening to people talking, and it's a very verbal, I think, household.
It's a lot of learning. Like, you're taking in information, you're connecting dots. I bet he asks questions all the time about the podcasts that y'all are listening to, and like,
Totally.
I think that makes it easier for a default to become mythology, right? Or like a
Yeah.
default to become, oh, let me like learn about this thing. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's really, really smart. What limits do you have on tech? And working in tech, how do you decide how much and what to expose to your family and to bring in and say, okay, like this is what we're intentionally bringing into our life?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it's a very hard conversation to have often. So, weekdays are so much easier because the time is so limited.
Mm-hmm.
My eldest gets 20 minutes of screen time after school while they eat the snack and unwind and change their clothes and like kind of get into after school mode. And that's largely unsupervised screen time, by which I mean they have an iPad with, you know, Netflix, Disney Plus, a couple of arcade games. I like Apple Arcade because it doesn't have any ads or microtransactions, so I kind of have given carte blanche to those games because they're a lot. It's just the walled garden situation. I find comfort in. I know lots of people don't like it, but for me and for raising kids, I think it's really useful. But no YouTube because unsupervised YouTube worries me very much, particularly when we see like political radicalization and those kinds of things happening in those spaces. And then as a family, we watch TV usually like Friday nights with dinner, and that's often my kiddo calls it video nights. That's when YouTube comes out and we watch those videos together. I've seen a lot of really tedious Pokemon videos that on another planet I would love them to watch by themselves. But no, we do it together as a family, again, because I'm not a big fan of unsecured YouTube. And they do play video games. We have a Nintendo Switch. My kiddo loves Pokemon, obviously, but also things like Animal Crossing, kind of like that level of game. My son's never been big on peril, which is really helpful. So, like war games and violent movies and that kind of thing has never been in his wheelhouse. But lately, because of a passion for Magic the Gathering, he now plays World of Warcraft only ever with his dad. And so, it's not a tech free house by any stretch of the imagination. We try to limit the amount, but sick days, a lot of TV on sick days, a lot of video games on sick days. In terms of the technology, I sometimes joke I'm like an educational technologist who secretly hates technology. I do try to limit what we bring into the house in terms of like what ecosystems we engage with. Before we had our second son, we often had like a smart speaker in the house. We don't use those anymore. Because I think that there's an awful lot of data harvesting going on, and I do feel responsible to my children for how much of their data escapes into the world. So we don't have their pictures on social media. We don't use their names online. We're really careful about how much of their presence exists on the internet before they can really meaningfully consent. That's been a big piece. And sometimes a complicated piece with school, for example, because school uses the Google ecosystem. So we have a lot of conversations with their teachers about what goes on to those spaces and what doesn't. And I'm a resolutely anti-AI person. I don't know how that conversation is playing out in the homeschool space, but generative AI I find deeply troubling from an intellectual property perspective, from an environmental perspective, from a labor rights perspective. It makes me very uncomfortable. So we don't play with AI in the house, at least with the kids. My husband uses it at work, I'm sure, and I have to be aware of it for my work, but from we're not making up videos on the weekend to make ourselves giggle or anything like that.
That's funny. That's very interesting. And it's really cool to hear your perspective on that. Definitely quite a few helpful tips and tricks. I do like the idea of not having unsupervised YouTube because there are so many rabbit holes that kids can go down, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And like having these walled gardens of like, okay, well, Netflix kids or like Disney kids or like having these things where it's like you as a parent can go through there and make sure that everything in there is what you want it to be. I know that there are a lot of other kid friendly video apps too. Having limits to time, that's really important. I know that it's a lot harder for homeschool families to do that as well because it's like, okay, well, you're home all the time.
Yeah.
And so these kids have access to all of their stuff. And I've talked to quite a few homeschool moms that are like, well, even for us, like we have a blocked amount of time that they can use it and a blocked amount of time where they can't. And I think that that is awesome. I'm curious your take really quickly on boredom. So we talked a little bit about why boredom is so valuable and important, but right, like you want your kids to to participate in extracurriculars, right? And your son is participating in lots of extracurriculars. But when do you pull back and when do you decide like, okay, I actually think that it would be more valuable for you to explore the things you have not explored yet and like figure out other things that you might like versus signing you up for more things that are structured, because they're both so important, right? You're mentioning the discipline, you're mentioning like being able to commit to something and learn it over time. But then on the other side, like just exploring your passions, just exploring, who you are and like thinking with yourself and being like, okay, well, these are the things that really fascinate me. I found that the kids that have spent a lot of time just being bored and kind of like with themselves have a really, really mature sense of self when they go off to college. And I find that that is more rare than not nowadays.
Yeah, I think you're much younger than me. I grew up in the 80s. There was an awful lot of go play. Just go play. Just go play, right? And even with our friends, like, just go play with your friends. Just go away. Go be elsewhere. That we don't do anymore, and I probably in many ways a very stereotypical millennial parent, and I probably am fairly helicoptery in that regard. And I think it differs for every kid. I think that's an important thing to note. I think there are all kinds of reasons, whether, like clinical reasons, like neurodivergence that might make students, an individual child more or less in need of sort of structured time. But I also just think kids' personalities. Like I know my kid needs a lot of downtime because they do best when they can rest their body and their brain, right? That's something that we're very aware of in our household. And I think sometimes you screw up. Like this term, we started off in the fall with martial arts Mondays and Wednesdays, flute on Tuesdays, and swimming on Saturdays and Sundays. And it is too much. And swimming ends this weekend. It's like we were going twice a week because I think it's better for learning when you're learning something physical to do it multiple times a week. But this swim class ends this coming Sunday, and I'm so excited to have weekend afternoons back because nothing sort of hems in your day quite as much as a 4:00 Saturday and Sunday swim lesson. Like what are we doing on the weekend? We're sitting around waiting for swim to start. So I think we did too much because I think we've lost the weekends. They can't really be very spontaneous or fun. Well, I mean, we have fun mornings and stuff, but we have to be home by like X amount of time. We had family in town last weekend, and it was very clear that like we can do stuff until this time, and then we have to be home to get ready for swim. And that felt way too structured for me, especially when we were trying to have family, right? We were trying to have visitors in town, and that really kind of hemmed in the kids' ability to just have fun time with people they don't see very often, right? So I think it changes for every family and it changes for every kid, but I think you have to be willing to say that you screwed up. And I feel really strongly that 5 nights a week of stuff was a mistake on my part. Because also our school often has fun nights on Thursdays. So we had like a bounce house night on a Thursday, and we're going to have a trunk or treat on a Thursday, and like we lose our Thursdays to school activities. So really it's like this poor kid has only had one night a week to just do nothing. And, even then they have to practice for flute and, just keep on top of French homework, and we're in French immersion and all these kinds of things. So yeah, I think the most important thing you can be as a parent or an educator is willing to say like, well, that was a mistake. We're not doing that again. And that is really what I learned this term is like, this was too much. And now I just have to make sure I act on it and don't just get excited about some new opportunity and sign us up for something else and overwhelm everyone once again, right? And that can be hard because you don't want to feel like you're saying no to an opportunity for your kiddo, and sometimes cool stuff comes up and you don't want to say no. We took a taiko drumming class like 3 weeks ago. It was amazing. I'm so glad we did it. We were exhausted, but I'm so glad we did it, right? Yeah. So you have to have space for that as well. But yeah, I don't know. I think figuring out the ideal formula for your own kid is really hard, and recognizing that it changes over time is really hard. And the most valuable thing you can be is flexible and willing to recognize when you've missed the mark.
This has been amazing. I have 3 final rapid fire questions for you.
Sure.
Question number 1, do you have any advice for teaching your own kids? It sounds like you and your kids chat often. It sounds like they are open to learning from you. Yeah. So Do you have any advice on that?
Car rides are the best time to have really difficult conversations. So there's a technology called Class Dojo that some of your listeners may be familiar with. It's a sort of a discipline app that used to track kids' behavior in class. And I'm very opposed to Class Dojo. I've written quite a few things about that level of extrinsically motivating kids and the problems with it, and also the ways in which it gets used sometimes to mark things that kids often have very little control over, like attendance and tardiness. Most kids are not in control of how they get to school and when they get to school. Marking them down for that is deeply problematic. We had a great conversation one day because I was really annoyed about it in a meeting that my child overheard, and then we had a conversation in the car. The car is great because you're not looking at each other, right? You're all looking at the same thing. I'm driving around to activities and stuff. There's usually a finite endpoint, so if the conversation gets too much for a kiddo, they know there's an endpoint, they know there's an exit valve. And so yeah, we talk about great things in the car, from birds and the bees type conversations to like, why are you so mad about this technology my teacher uses and what am I supposed to do with that information, mom? Those are really good conversations to have when you're not trying to make eye contact and be super serious with each other.
I love that. That was actually a great piece of advice, and I would concur that I've had some of the best conversations ever whenever you're just locked into a car and it's like, okay, what else are we going to do? Let's just chat.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you have multiple kids, and also you have done a lot of research on teaching, right? And most teaching has to do with lots of kids in a classroom. How do you determine which kids to give focus to and how to teach many kids at one time?
Super hard, and I don't think anybody's figured out like the ideal answer to this. I think in general, I'm a big believer, and this is a theme that comes up in the podcast a lot, is that we have to lead our classrooms with care and with a student-centered approach. And what that means to me is that we're always looking around the room to see who needs additional challenge and who is getting lost. It's really difficult within the current classroom environment at most institutions to do that well. But I think even just being able to connect with a parent, or being able to connect, in the case of post-secondary, being able to connect with that adult learner afterwards and say like, hey, I've noticed that you are really looking at C during like X, Y, and Z. How can we deal with this? What are the resources that you might be able to access? What are some things that might help? When students know that you know who they are, they learn better. They make better connections with the course material when they have a better connection to the person in front of the room. And I know people don't always like to talk about that because it can feel like, first of all, a huge additional responsibility on the educator, but also it can feel like, oh, well, you're putting feelings or relationships ahead of facts and learning. But I think the reality is that the facts and learning are meaningless outside of the context of relationality. And that's how we, as humans, we're social beings. That's how we learn. So I think when you're looking at a classroom and you have a wide disparity in ability, trying to figure out how to split your focus, even if you can just make sure you're making connections with the students who clearly need more or who clearly need additional supports, even if you're giving them resources to take that outside of the classroom, which may be the only option that you have, knowing that you see them and their struggle or see them and their extended capacities has a lot of value.
Yeah, that's amazing. And my last question for you is, so you do a lot for secondary, college, university. What is the best way to approach K-12 to prep kids for whatever comes next?
Oh gosh, yeah, such a good question. What I'm most interested in what we can learn from the K-12 sector, because I think we don't pay enough attention to what happens in K-12. But I think in general, preparing students for more independent learning is really helpful. So if students show up in the university and they are expecting, for example, like they don't have good note-taking skills, they don't have the ability to discern like key important pieces of information, those students are the students who struggle the most and the fastest. Like note-taking skills is the number one thing you can do for your learners, whether you're a teacher or a parent, to make sure that they succeed in post-secondary, because that is often the biggest jump. Students go from in grade 12 still having, whether they're copying off a board or they're given that package of materials, to dropped into a university classroom where somebody just talks at them. And that gap is often the biggest one that needs to be broached. That, and helping especially your 10, 11, 12 students break away from that 5-paragraph essay they probably won't get a ton of instruction in post-secondary. They'll just get told, don't do it. So helping your learner bridge that gap, hugely valuable.
This has been so fascinating and so helpful. Where can people find you if they're interested in learning more?
Oh, yeah. So you can email me anytime. I'm bgray@tru.ca. TRU is Thompson Rivers University, where I work. More than welcome to email me there. I'm on Blue Sky at Brenna C. Gray. And then I have a website that desperately needs an update, but it's brennaclarkegray.ca.
That is amazing. Well, everybody, I hope that you enjoyed this. And thank you again so much for hopping on.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.